EMS Head On podcast. So today I'm joined by Matt, and I'm gonna let you introduce yourself to
Sure, I am Matt Streger. I am a paramedic from New Jersey originally, and currently, although I've spent some time other places around the country, I'm a practicing healthcare EMS lawyer for about the last 20 years. I've been in EMS, been a medic about 38 years, still practice, still ride the ambulance, and get to come to places like North Carolina and teach. We're here doing our leadership development program and teaching Just Culture later today.
So one of the things I wanted to talk about was some of the stuff with criminalization of medicine, and so I found some news that comes out of Aurora Fire Rescue, where Jeremy Cooper, the last of the first responders convicted for his role in the tragic incident, was sentenced to 4 years probation, with 14 months to be served in a work release program, along with 100 hours of community service, which is nearly 5 years after the death of Elijah McClain. So, both Jeremy and his former partner were both charged. So
and convicted.
So that really changes the whole thing for us as healthcare providers and paramedics.
It doesn't change a thing for us. What it does is catch us up to what the rest of the healthcare world's been doing. Because this is the thing, is we practice healthcare. And now everyone's treating us like the healthcare providers that we really are.
Right, because there was a nurse that was convicted out in Tennessee.
There was
a couple of years ago.
But this has been happening in healthcare for millennia. I was doing research on this, and I found an article out of the Royal Society of Medicine journal from England that did a retrospective analysis of physicians who were criminally charged for medical errors going back to 1795. This is not something new. I represented physicians for the first.
The lights are blinking on us. I don't know why.
I'm doing that with my mind.
Oh, okay.
The first 10 years of my practice was representing doctors and nurses and other healthcare providers, EMS as well. And I had a lecture called The Criminalization of Medicine, because we were seeing that happen 10, 15, 20 years ago for physicians and nurses and other people like that. And it's not just for overprescribing or, sexual assault, the criminalization, because there's an epidemic of boundary issue violations in healthcare. So when you have physicians who sexually assault patients, or nurses, that's a crime. Okay. Overprescribing medication, the opioid crisis, low-hanging fruit, super easy one, lots of prosecutions on that. But the prosecution for the gross negligence, these laws have been on the books for centuries. 1795 in England. This is nothing new. And the funny thing is, I'm lucky that I've been around in EMS long enough to remember some of the stories that a lot of people have forgotten. There was a story of a guy named Frankie Rodriguez, who was a homeless man, young man, 22, in Perth Amboy, New Jersey in the early 90s. And the Perth Amboy First Aid Squad went out and they were, physical with him, and decided they want to take him to the hospital. So instead of transporting him to the hospital that's in town, they left him on the dock. But the dock, of course, juts out into the Arthur Kill, which is the body of water that separates Perth Amboy, New Jersey from Staten Island, where he, in his intoxicated and somewhat unconscious state from being beat up, rolled over, fell into the Arthur Kill and drowned. And they criminally prosecuted and obtained a guilty plea, in fact, of the senior person on that crew. So this isn't that new. We just don't have great memories. And, we're realizing now, and one of the take-homes for me out of the Aurora case is that we're being treated like the rest of the healthcare world. And we may not like it. We actually are better than most of the healthcare world because they operate on a straight negligence standard for civil liability. But we're operating on a lot of the same rules that they are now because we practice healthcare. For the record, I just want to go back to the sentencing. Both paramedics in the case received the statutory minimums that they could get. Just to be clear, the judge could have thrown the book at them and put them both away for 20, 25 years. Chihuniak's 5-year incarceration was because he had a second-degree assault charge, and that is the lowest that the judge could impose for somebody with a second-degree assault charge. The work release and the probation was the lowest that they could impose under the state sentencing guidelines. So the judge really was as lenient as he was capable of being in those cases, just to be clear. I think people look at those sentences and say, holy bro, those are really bad. And they are. But also in the context of the law doesn't differentiate and say, hey, a second-degree assault charge by a firefighter paramedic is going to be treated differently than a second-degree assault charge from the person on the street.
So if they got the minimum,
yep,
then what kind of message is that sending to the public?
It depends on which segment of the public you're talking about. Remember, rule number one, I have a lecture on this, and rule number one is that all of these prosecutions are political. And this was as political as any prosecution. Remember, they were originally no cause at the grand jury until they had a state listed as a local prosecutor. The state prosecutor came to look at it because the George Floyd had happened in the intervening time, and they decided to relook at the case, and they indicted after that. The message that it sends to some segments of the community is there's lack of accountability. I would submit to you that if you're an African-American person in the Colorado area, you're probably looking through the lens of saying they got away with it. Even though they were convicted, they were given the minimum, and there's less accountability there. If you're looking from a public safety perspective, you say the judge appropriately applied the sentencing range guidelines and said they are not the same as a second-degree assault from somebody who was on the street, who was, going around beating people and killing them. They were paramedics that were sent there to save a life and did some really bad stuff, but they didn't set out to go hurt somebody that way. And they probably applied that sentencing guideline. So where you stand probably depends on where you sit.
So you just made a very important statement that, nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to go to work today and hurt somebody.
Nope.
So how does that play into the whole sentencing piece and everything else?
I don't know the sentencing guidelines in Colorado. It really depends, very, very limited on the application of state law. So they have to look at what there are always what are called aggravating factors and mitigating factors. And what they do is when you do a criminal sentencing, you basically put them on a big spreadsheet, and the judge says, yeah, no, yeah, no, yeah, no, yeah, and then says this overweighs that, whichever side you're going on, and then has a range that he, in this case, can go through and pick from. Federal sentencing guidelines are a little bit more rigid. They actually apply points to them. And they will say, well, based on this number of points, this is what your sentence is.
So should we also, be closely following the Floyd case and everything else that happens there?
I think you need to follow all of the politics with everything that's happening, because none of this happens in a vacuum. George Floyd was in Minneapolis, and Aurora was in Colorado. They're not even close to each other, but this was a national discussion on race and police violence. And you can't have this discussion without considering the world that all of this took place in.
So with this particular case, so with Elijah McClain, let's go back and just review the basic facts of what happened in the case. So often EMS gets summoned because something happens. Law enforcement, we're called because some triggering factor has now said this person needs care from EMS. When they got there, at what point did this whole thing start to move one direction or the other?
I think it went off the rails the moment they got to the patient. So if you watch the videos and read the formal Aurora after action report, they parked the block away and they shut up with no equipment. And they stood there, and if you watch, they literally stand over him and don't do any patient care, and they don't attempt any patient care. The only person who touches him is a guy who takes an ear pod out. That's it. So this whole thing went off the rails from the very beginning because they walked over and didn't do patient care and didn't try to do patient care. And that was the break point in the whole thing, because this is a completely different conversation. The whole thing is different. If they walk over, and I'm going to say that one of my life lessons from this is the duty to intervene as a thing now. We have established the formal duty to intervene. And if they got there and went to one of the cops who was holding Elijah McClain down, or to a senior officer at the scene, sergeant, lieutenant, whoever was their VPD, and said, hey, I gotta take care of this guy. He doesn't look good. Can we do this differently? Roll him over, sit him up, hold him, retain him, keep control of him. But I don't like the way he looks. He's obtunded. He's not breathing well. He's lethargic. He doesn't look like he's fighting a whole lot. He may have been fighting with you before, but he's not fighting right now. I need to do some assessment on this guy, and we'll figure out what to do because he's a patient. We're not having this conversation right now. We are not talking because either they do that and they've done their duty, which is to do the patient care, because this is not a ketamine case. Hint, hint, wink, wink. This has nothing to do with ketamine. This case failed on their failure to intervene and to do patient care. Because if they touch the lieutenant and say, we got to do something here, and he goes, or she goes, yeah, you're right, and they let them intervene, we're not having a conversation. And if they've got a body camera of them going to the senior officer, lieutenant at the scene, and saying, I don't like this guy. He's a sick person. He doesn't look good. I have no idea what's going on with him. He could be hypoglycemic. He could have head trauma. He could be hypoxic. I got to assess him. And the cop said, stand there. Don't touch him. This is a police matter. We're not letting you into the scene. Oh, sorry, I'm going to stand back here. But now you're going to have me on body camera talking, going, I tried to do my job. And you were barred from accessing the patient and say, look, I'm uncomfortable with this. It's on you. If you're telling me that this guy can't be touched right now, that's you. And then you stand back. And there's no jury that's going to convict you under those circumstances.
So, you know, a lot of times when law enforcement arrests someone, they put the cuffs on them. They're often, you know, face down on the ground. Their hands are behind them, so they lose the bellows effect to breathe off CO2. Especially in this case where he had built, you know, CO2.
And he had also been choked out twice before the medics got there, which they candidly didn't know.
Right.
But his presentation was obtunded on arrival. I've had patients with excited delirium. I've been thrown around the room. My partner's been thrown around the room. This was not an excited delirium case, not the issue. But this wasn't a scene safety case. This wasn't a case where, like, okay, I totally get when you get there why there's 9 people standing on this guy because he got the strength of 10 men and he's dusted up and he's killing you. He was sitting there on the ground not doing anything.
Yeah. So if we arrive and we can, you know, turn them on their side or talk to law enforcement, and we can say, hey, we need to turn this person over. Can we, you know, move the cuffs in the front? They're often reluctant to do that. So how do we overcome that with our partners in law enforcement?
So one of the things that is a phenomenal question, and one of the things I've been teaching recently and have devved a class on them, and I think we all need to adopt, is crew resource management, CRM. So it's an aviation concept to how to address going against the power gradient. So when you have a power gradient in the airplane, you have a captain of the airplane who's the god. He or she is in charge of the plane, and the world stops at them. And people on the front of the plane are usually reluctant to say to the captain, this isn't going well. You're doing something wrong, because the power gradient in healthcare, you see that with physicians and nurses and other allied health people. You see that with paramedics and law enforcement. There's a power gradient that people are reluctant to go against, especially when they're newer, especially when there are gender issues or racial issues, depending on the makeup of people, depending on the circumstances, their experience level, they're reluctant to go against the power gradient. We need to teach the structured way of people going against that through CRM. There's a thing called PACE methodology, where you probe, concern. No, I totally messed that up.
That's all right.
I haven't had my coffee yet. You get your coffee, but I haven't had my coffee with the PACE methodology. But basically, you probe, alert, concern, emergency for the 4 levels and say, Bradley, I have a concern about this patient. But instead of saying Bradley, I would say your formal title and your, as a paramedic Streger, I have a concern about this. Captain Smith, I have a concern about this iceberg. Whatever the thing is you say, there are magic words that you use. And part of this is going to be training our people on how to do that, letting them know that we have their back when we do it. Part of it's going to be working with partners in fire, EMS, other agencies, law enforcement, hospitals, so that when you walk into the trauma bay and someone's not listening to you, you can use the magic concern. You know, a lot of HRO organizations have adopted that terminology, the PACE methodology, the I have a concern is the first level, to say that's the magic word in an HRO organization to go up the power gradient that should trigger a stop. It doesn't always, which is why there is continued escalation. It's called graded assertiveness to go up that chain. But that's the thing we need to do, is we need to teach people how to formally structure going against that power gradient so that these things don't happen. Because the other piece of it is, and I said it, there's a duty to intervene that has been imposed upon us, and I don't disagree with it, but I'm going to tell you that it is a formal duty at this point. If you see something, one of your colleagues, law enforcement, a nurse, I don't care who it is, but you see somebody doing something wrong, you have an obligation to say and stop it. You have an obligation. You can't just be like, not my problem. You have an obligation to say to the cop, the nurse, the firefighter, one of the other paramedics. I did on a paramedic call about a year ago. One of the ALS intercept medics I was working with was giving the wrong medicine to somebody. And I'm like, no, that's not going to happen. We're stopping that. And he said, why? And he did stop, and I explained to him the circumstances as to why it was the clinically wrong medication to be giving at this point. Then probably would have killed my patient. And he stopped and did the right thing. But again, I have 38 years and I got gray hair. I'm a guy, which certainly helps on the gender issues when you look at this. We need to empower every person with training to do that. So that and I'm going to say this because the power gradient is always going to be the least for the younger person, and for women up the power gradient, that we need to empower the youngest woman in our crews to go against that power gradient to a senior male law enforcement officer, which is probably the biggest gulf of power that I can think of in our world.
So that duty to intervene, applies to everybody.
I think so. It's been going back to Eric Garner, one of the first people that had an encounter with law enforcement that resulted in their death by asphyxia. And one of the first questions that was asked, this is going back a decade now, was why didn't the medics stop this? And everybody was like, because they're the EMTs from FDNY in New York City, they don't interfere with the cops. Cops are doing their job. They're going to stand back and wait until they're given a patient. And I don't think we can say that anymore. A decade later, I think that you have an obligation to go to the cops calmly, respectfully, structured way, and to say to them, hey, that guy's sick. We lose sight. Go to the Illinois case. I'm sure you saw the video out of Illinois, one of the most egregious videos I've ever seen in my life. And I think in a weird way empowers every medic and EMT in the world to look at their partner and say, we're not doing that. I'm not going to be that person on that video. So that's not happening on my watch. That gives a little power, up the power gradient to a new person to say to the senior, burned out, crusty old person, hey, that's not okay. We're not going to be them. Okay. But we have to have that ability to walk in and say, that's not okay. That guy, the guy on the Illinois case, there was no assessment done. There was nothing. They literally, she is yelling at him, Earl, tell me your goddamn name. She walked in with a piece of paper and then threw the piece of paper down on the bed. She had to have a piece of equipment. That guy could have a litany, AEIOU tips, right?
Right.
He could have been intoxicated. He could be hypoglycemic. He could be a drug overdose. He could have head trauma. He could be septic. He could have had a stroke. He could have low blood sugar. I think I may have said that. There's a whole list of things that could be going on with him. And instead, she refused to treat him like a patient. This is what gets us in trouble. There was a case in Rochester recently where what was a very obviously a hypoxic, uncooperative patient in the back of an ambulance there became handsy with the crew. They pulled him at the side of the road. Law enforcement kicked him out at the side of the road, and he walked out of the side of the road and died at the side of the road. He wasn't handsy with them. He was hypoxic. These are patients. We do patient care. We're losing sight of that.
Yeah. So, you brought up the Illinois case. So let's look at the Illinois case as well as the Elijah McClain case. They parked a block away and took no equipment. I don't know about anybody else, but where I work, it says in our SOP that we should take the appropriate equipment to the patient. Now, that leaves it wide open about what that appropriate equipment is, but not a piece of paper, not your towel.
No.
Take the appropriate equipment.
And again, I work in EMS. If I get out and I park at the side of the patient, I go to the Cherry Hill Mall and the patient's standing right there at the Cherry Hill Mall and he's standing there talking to the police, I'm going to open the door and go talk to him. If I need something and he collapses right there, my ambulance is 3 steps behind me. I'm not going to pull the stretcher before I go talk to the patient. That's common sense. But if you're going into a house, you need to bring primary equipment with you because patients decompensate. Sometimes you get the surprise call, and I'm not going to make fun of dispatchers by any means, because dispatchers have a hard job. I was a dispatcher for a long time. Every field person makes fun of every dispatcher on earth because they always give us bad information. All the dispatchers make fun of the field people for their reasons as well. I get it. There's always a dichotomy there. But at the end of the day, sometimes you get bad info. And you walk in the room and you're like, oh yeah, this back pain is a dissecting triple I. And you're like, I don't have anything with me, you know.
And I typically put my equipment on the stretcher, take
Me
the
too.
stretcher to the door.
Me too.
And if I don't need it, I got time to take it back. If I do need it, it's right there.
I would say that there's a system issue here. I think that we are trying to maximize our UHU. We're trying to maximize the efficiency. It drives me a little crazy that we make people bring a carrying device to the door on every call. I go into every call. I have no idea if the patient's conscious, unconscious, stairs, no stairs. I can bring my stretcher there. Maybe the patient doesn't need a stretcher, they can walk to the ambulance. It doesn't make any sense to do that. To me, that's a rule that was created because people weren't bringing anything in. I'm going to the 8th floor. Yeah, I'm bringing the stretcher up the stairs, and the 8th floor is an elevator. I'm going into a house where there's a private house and I'm 15, 20 feet from the ambulance, and I might have to come back in a stair chair or a Reeves or a scoop. It's a little silly to me to be dragging something randomly into the house that might not be the right patient movement device. But we're trying to move the calls because we don't have enough ambulances and we don't have enough throughput, and we're trying to get those calls back out there. But the basic medical equipment. I mean, I was at AAA earlier this week, and I had a man have look like a seizure, and I think it was a vasovagal event about 20 feet from me. And there were 9 practicing ER physicians who were right there on top of the guy, took good care of him. So I kind of was, watching the scene and, coordinating stuff and getting him out of the room. And I'm like, we have 9 people here with what's in their brain and hands at the end of their arms and nothing else. It would be super cool to get us like a heart monitor or a BP cuff or a deck stick, a stethoscope, or like find out what's going on with this guy. Because without basic assessment equipment, swing into the breeze, no idea what was going on with this guy. Why we don't bring basic equipment into every call? That should be a never event. That is, we talk about things that are never events in healthcare. The failure to bring the basic minimum equipment to the patient's side, to have it immediately accessible. And like I said, if you're 15 feet from the ambulance, it is immediately accessible. If you're in a house, it's not.
Right.
It needs to be immediately accessible. That should be a never event for EMS.
Yeah, which I think we could probably do a different podcast on never events. And
I'll tell you what, we have a policy manual that we just offered for sale, shameless plug. Come on. We
good.
Have a policy manual with like 119 camera ready policies, and every policy we have has a template with never events red at the very bottom on a policy by policy basis.
So for those that are listening, tell them where they can actually get them.
They can contact me at the firm, keavneystrieger.com, KEAVNEYSTREGER.com. Go fill out the form and I'll send you some info on it. And it's not vaporware, which is really kind of cool actually, because it's all real. Policies are all ready to go. A little bit of customization. You have to type in some, specifics about that. But, to bring this all full circle, we have a policy on identifying when a patient is, policy on refusals, policy on restraining patients, policy on weapons and finding weapons on patients, how to secure them, policy on dispute resolution and crew resource management. We have all of these policies based on these things.
And they're developed because, one, you work as a paramedic.
I do.
You understand the law because you're also, practicing lawyer. And, so all that stuff is out there and readily available.
Yeah, and they're evolving. I mean, the thing too is that I did not originally have a CRM piece in the dispute resolution policy. It was actually disputing with your partner, how to conflict resolve with your partner. It wasn't the external, very power gradient one. So I took that and I added that piece into it because you need that. Now, to be clear, the policy alone isn't enough. You're going to need to do CRM training. You're going to need to do de-escalation training. You're going to need to do weapons training. All of those things have to be done for your crew. They need to be trained on it in addition to just handing them a policy that says, hey, by the way, here's how to de-escalate, is not going to effectively make people be good at de-escalating scenes.
Well, no, because you got to teach them how to do that. Exactly. And you got to practice, just like any other policy.
Yes.
You got to review the policy, do any training that's necessary with it, and then in some cases, practice the process. And
then refresh it and continually reinforce it.
Because if you don't practice the process, it's just black and white on paper, or red in some cases.
In this, so yeah. So my take-home lessons from Aurora. Number one, the duty to intervene is a real thing. Okay. Number two, a lot of the defense for this case was, we're just dumb paramedics. And I'm saying that with my tongue in my cheek a little bit, but that was kind of the defense was, hey, look, this is a protocol. If A, then B, we follow it. We do this stuff. We just do what's written on the paper and we don't use any kind of judgment. And jury didn't buy that. And I think the take home lesson there is we practice medicine. This is healthcare. Interestingly, a piece of this was also, this is my partner's fault. Remember, they were both represented individually because as criminal defendants, you have to, most of the time, you have to have your own independent counsel. So the two paramedics, Chihuniak and Cooper, were represented independently, put on their cases independently. And part of it was this as their technique. And the jury said, not a chance. And interestingly, Cooper administered the ketamine. Chihuniak was a lieutenant. He was in charge of the scene. He was the one who had the second-degree assault charge, even though he didn't push the needle. Think about that. You cannot say, not my problem. This was my partner. I've been saying for decades, if your partner does it, and you write it down, you sign off on that charge, you ratify that, you own it. And this is a wonderful, terrible example, illustratively, of that principle, which is you can't just throw your hands up. And again, the duty to intervene too. When your partner is doing something silly,
yeah. So sounds like they're moving a bunch of stuff.
Sounds like they're moving a bunch of stuff here at this conference.
So yeah, big take home point is, yeah, one, they were charged individually, tried individually, but
well, they were tried together,
right?
But they had separate representation in the same trial. So the police officers were all tried individually. The two paramedics were tried at the same trial, but represented by separate counsel.
So the biggest piece of this to take home is you are responsible for your partner if you are the crew chief, if you are the,
even if you're not the crew chief.
Well, right.
I think everybody's responsible for what their partner does.
So it doesn't matter if you're EMT and you're working with a paramedic, or you're EMT working with EMT or paramedic working with paramedic. You're responsible for your partner and what they do.
To a level. If you have an EMT who has a paramedic partner, it's hard to audit the medicine up that scale, but you still have the duty if you know something is wrong. Trust me, I credential at the BLS level, even though I'm a medic, because I don't work enough to credential at the ALS level. So by choice, I'm actually work as an EMT. No one's going to say to me, well, Matt, you're just an EMT. I'm an inactive medic cert. I've been a medic for 38 years. My brain doesn't turn off just because I don't have the psychomotor skills to do this on a daily basis. My assessment skills are my assessment skills. My brain is my brain. So if you're an EMT with that capability, you can't just throw up your arms and go, well, I'm just an EMT. They're the paramedic. They're in charge of everything. It's to what you're capable of doing, what your scope is, what your training is, what your experience level is.
So, and that goes to say that your scope of knowledge is not limited by your scope of practice.
Oh, 100%. That is so well phrased. We have EMTs who are also nurses, physicians. They credential at the BLS level because that's the unit they're working on, and that's what they can do for the system that they're in. That doesn't mean their brain. I don't take my paramedic brain out and leave like, how to read an EKG doesn't come in there. Like if I'm in the ambulance and I see an EKG, there's some more movement going on here.
Oh yeah.
I don't look at the medics and be like, well, I know you're doing that wrong, but I'm an EMT today, so I'm not going to stop you. I stopped the medic the other day for giving cardism to a second patient because the patient was tachycardic. Well, they were tachycardic, but it wasn't reentry cardiac tachycardia. It was compensatory tachycardia. And I said to the medic, and we're not giving this patient cardism. And he said, why? And I explained it. It wasn't, I'm just an EMT today. I have no duty to stop that. I mean, remember at the end of the day, we need to fix the focus. And I think in many respects, we lost the focus. The focus has to be that guy or that gal laying on the ground looking up at us. We've lost sight of that in a lot of respects. We move fast, we cut corners, we normalize deviance, we lose our focus. Elijah McClain was a kid that we didn't need to die. And that's a fact. And there's no getting around that at the end of the day. Is he was a neurodivergent young boy who none of the circumstances happened the way they should have. But I think that they treated him more as a patient and remember that he's looking up the ground at them, and your job is to treat him like a sick person because we do health care. That's the thing. You can do healthcare of a big red truck with hoses on it. I can do healthcare off a blue and white truck that comes from the hospital. It doesn't matter. If I carry drugs around, I'm doing healthcare. And that's the lesson is the jury treated him that way.
So take home thing is, it doesn't matter where you practice, what you do. You're responsible for the care that's provided. You have a duty to intervene, and always work closely with your partner. So if they were to get a hold of you, how can they reach out to you? I know you gave the website.
Website's the best. You can always use the inquiry form on the website. You can call 732-806-1395 is the firm's phone number. You can email me. It's Matthew at the website, Streger.com, and we can get in touch that way. You can send me a carrier pigeon because I'm in New York. You can send me an owl if you're in the Harry Potter world. I'm a Slytherin.
So, and you can always reach out to us on the EMS Handoff podcast.
Yes, they can reach out to you and you can send them.
Yeah, I can send them.
Thank you.
So bradley.dean@handoffmedia.com or on social media. So thanks for joining us. And remember that you are responsible, and never, underestimate the value of your EMS handoff.